Hello everyone, and welcome to the Altering Shifting Communing Conversation Series, a project presented and hosted by Call for Curators. I am Ilaria Conti, the curator of this series, and today we are hosting the last talk of 2020, after which we will take a brief recess and come back in 2021 with new conversations and also an updated format. So for those who are tuning in for the first time, ALT SHIFT COMM is an ongoing conversation series on curatorial practices that cultivate communal and decolonial approaches and that rethink critically and ethically their role. So we have been gathering throughout this year on Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. Berlin time for conversations with practitioners from diverse contexts to discuss practices that are rooted in process and research and that foster ethical forms of relationality. So today I give my very warmest welcome to Demian. Thank you so much for being here, the founder of R.I.S.E Indigenous. And so just to remind everyone about the structure, we will have a conversation for the next 40 minutes approximately. In the meantime, as always, I encourage those who are watching to ask questions through the comment section on Facebook and YouTube, and also share thoughts or questions by email at our email address, which I'm going to show very briefly. So again, Demian, thank you so much for being with us. I would like just to get started to ask you briefly to introduce yourself. And also, I'm going to ask you the very first question, which is always the same since we started this series, which is, how are you, where are you, and how have these past months been?
Yeah, thank you. Yate, my name is Demian DinéYazhi. I'm born to the clans Nastaje, Tabahe, and Torachitni of the Diné tribe. I am from the Diné Reservation, which is around the Four Corners region of the southwestern United States. My family is from just outside of this space called Segi, or more commonly it's referred to as Canyon de Chelly, and I grew up in Gallup, New Mexico. But presently I live in Portland, Oregon, where I practice, and I've been pretty much here for the last 14 years, I guess, at this point. So I'm in the ancestral lands of the Chinook, the Kalapuya, the Multnomah, Cowlitz, and various other tribes that have migrated and traded and lived in this region in the Willamette Valley of Oregon.
Thank you. And so then, as I mentioned before, I would say let's just get right into it and talk about R.I.S.E Indigenous. I would like to ask you how the project started in the first place, from which context, research, but also genealogies and urgencies somewhat. So if you can just guide us through a little bit the beginnings. And it has different social media accounts and your website as well. I'm just going to share for now the Instagram because it's been very active. So I think it's a good place to start for those who might not know the project and just want to have a look while listening to you.
Yeah, R.I.S.E actually started from, so I think it goes back to cultural and ancestral roots. As a Indigenous person, and I believe every single Indigenous tribe has different customs and beliefs. I can only speak to those of the Diné tribe. I do have Zuni ancestry that dates back to the time of the Long Walk, so the late 1800s. But I'm not as familiar or as connected to my Zuni ancestry. But I feel like a lot of my own traditional practices and worldview and philosophy has all been shaped by Indigenous Diné philosophy and ways of viewing and being in the world. And so with that, is this profound amount of reverence for the land and place, as well as our creation stories. And for the Diné, it's very important that, you know, we stay within the ancestral sort of like boundaries of what we consider our you know, territory or space or homelands, and so those exist within the four sacred mountains. And once we leave those four sacred mountains, like, you know, historically we've been doing this, you know, for centuries. We've migrated, you know, down to the Southwest, and a lot of this has been like written about and accounted for in our creation stories. But you know, yeah, I feel like when I'm what I'm trying to do, or what I'm trying to reference right now, is the connection that we have to our sacred homelands within the four sacred mountains, which are geographic boundaries. And so, you know, when we are within our sacred homelands, that's when, you know, we are at our strongest. That's when we are like most connected to Diné philosophy and culture and customs and Hajan, which is like this really beautiful way of engaging with the world and being at peace with oneself, and being in balance and in harmony with the world around you, cosmologically, with, you know, the water and the earth itself and animals and plant beings and such. And so once, you know, we leave that, we leave the four sacred mountains, you know, we step into other people's ancestral homelands. You know, we still maintain and you know, strive to maintain that balance and that harmony within ourselves. But we are, you know, we are still migrating and moving outside of our space, our traditional space. And so coming up to Portland, Oregon was really interesting because I felt that like cultural disconnect almost immediately. I always joke that like Portland forced me to sort of familiarize myself more with like white folk, and forced me to learn how to build relationships and communities with them. And so it was really strange being here, you know, and I didn't take care of myself for, you know, the first bit of it. I didn't really feel connected to who I was as an Indigenous person, and I kind of took all that for granted. And so I was really lonesome and wanting to find community and build community. And the ways that I felt that I could do that was imagining like a space that could actually exist. And what ended up happening was building and thinking about like virtual spaces as a means of building community. And I feel like as a queer person, that was like one space that I was very familiar with, like in building community, reaching out, finding other people, like finding safer spaces to exist in and build relationships, and like work on like who you are as like a sexual person, as an intelligent person, as a creative person. You know, I feel like all of that was fostered through the internet and technologies. And so it was only sort of like natural that my inkling to want to build community with Indigenous people would also take the shape of, you know, building platforms and online spaces for Indigenous peoples. And so a lot of that came out of like wanting to create a space that was about embracing these traditional aspects of who we are as Indigenous people, but also sort of reaching beyond that and thinking about how we evolve as Indigenous people, how current present day Indigenous people are thinking about assimilative and conservative traditionalism, and wanting to really just dismantle that and break that apart, because that seems to be like such an overwhelming, claustrophobic, and oppressive force that invades Indigenous communities. And it, you know, it happens in our tribal governments. It happens within our families. It leads to racism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, anti-Blackness, and so, and even self-colonization. You know, we learn through assimilation how to perpetuate colonial tactics against ourselves and one another as a means to like silence us, and continually pursue settler colonialism within our communities. The very existence of tribal governments is a strong reflection of that. The fact that tribal governments are formed as a means for the settler colonial empire to come in and create legislation and laws that allow them to take over our water rights, that allow them to extract coal and uranium from the reservation without being responsible for properly cleaning it up, or even just simple protocol of asking instead of this like taking and taking and taking. And so R.I.S.E kind of came out of wanting to focus on thinking about how we envision the future, and that future, it is important for us to consider that that future be dreamt of, imagined, and actualized through Indigenous, queer, trans, two-spirit, gender non-conforming, non-binary, feminist, and matriarchal kin within our societies. So we're striving to sort of amplify that, you know, put as much effort into calling out other Indigenous spaces that perpetuate like settler colonial political fuckery, and while at the same time like completely like disregarding and leaving behind other marginalized people within our own societies.
Thank you for this. And so then precisely about this notion of sort of kinship, one important element that has emerged while we were talking, and also in everything I've always read about R.I.S.E Indigenous and so on, is this notion of collective, which I found to be very interesting, because while we were prepping for this talk, I understood that it has taken, in the context of this project, a very specific interpretation, or it is somewhat a strategy, but it's also a conscious choice. So I wanted to ask you a bit more how you're interpreting this notion of the collective, or a collective, right? When we say R.I.S.E Indigenous is a collective, but what does it mean in this context? What kind of strategy you've developed in order to, you know, to make it operational somewhat, and why also?
Yeah, well, you know, I think, you know, I was interested in the collective because at the time that I was sort of thinking about R.I.S.E and what spaces could look like, I was, you know, really interested in like queer activism, ACT UP, group material. I mean, I was, that shit like blew my mind, like thinking about all of the work that queer communities had done, you know, while I was like coming into my own queerness and like ambivalence and fear of like what that meant, while being aware of like the HIV and AIDS crisis, and seeing like mainstream America, like in a shitty small town like Gallup, New Mexico, a racist, conservative, you know, the Republicans run as Democrats down there so they can get nominated. Like it's crooked, it's backwards. It is a very, you know, telling, or it is like a very interesting reflection of like of America. Like small towns in America are like teeming with like so much knowledge that you know we could be learning from in order to like help build like better strategies for the future. But you know, when I'm going through like my queerness and trying to like unravel all that, you know, I'm being fed like this very conservative and Christian based sort of idea of what it means to be queer, and the fear that is embedded in that, the shame that is embedded in that. I'm not being, you know, it wasn't until like I was in college, you know, well into my 20s, that I began to learn more about ACT UP and group material and all these other forms of activism that were invested in my future, my well-being, my health, and that, you know, was invested in saving lives. And so I felt like an immediate sort of connection to that. I realized that, you know, group material was very successful in infiltrating institutions, art institutions, simultaneously being very like critical of them and critical of like larger societal issues. And so I just naturally really wanted to like figure out like what that looked like, or how that sort of model could benefit Indigenous communities. But as I started to create more work with R.I.S.E, initially I was really interested in this idea of imagining and anonymity, and anonymity as like a subversive and well, as a subversive tactic, but also like as a means of like political warfare against like settler colonialism. And so I was thinking about like some of the earlier images that R.I.S.E was utilizing, old photographs and such, that were taken from white photographers and anthropologists and such. I was thinking of some of this engagement and interaction that we were having in these spaces, even like with old like paintings, of America, of westward expansion. I thought of like the act of us like taking images on the internet and using them and recontextualizing them and appropriating them. I thought of that as like a continuation of like raiding cavalry camps, during the 1800s. I thought of it as a just as another act of like stealing and taking and reclaiming. And so a lot of the earlier images were sort of embedded in this idea of like imagining what this collective could look like, not really having anyone specifically tied to understanding it. I'm not talking about it in terms of like a Banksy sort of thing, but more of this idea of like how things get archived and like where they come from and how these things get lost. But I also, I think what gets mixed up in that too, is also the fear of erasing your own voice, erasing like your own culture, and that has historically been, imposed onto Indigenous peoples, like with or without our consent. And so I think, when I was going through my whole thesis process, one thing that came up was like my advisors telling me that like it was important that this thing actually exists. Granted, it was a bunch of like white advisors and such, but it eventually got R.I.S.E to come into spaces as it currently does. And so as I'm sorry that I'm kind of like meandering and going around this question of like the collective, but like I think I was, as much as I was drawn to the collective, I was also fearful of like what a collective, a core set of like collective members can possibly do to a thing, can do to a group of individuals, how it can create a sort of stasis. There were a lot of like Indigenous collectives that were formed by non-Indigenous people. And so I thought that it was important that this one be formed and informed and maintained by an Indigenous person, by an Indigenous queer non-binary person. And so as I've come to sort of like think about like R.I.S.E's role and how it functions, I think a much more sort of fruitful engagement would be to work with a variety of different artists, and through that engagement and collaboration with various artists, that in turn like allows R.I.S.E to like shift and take on various forms and messages, and also like through that collaboration also allows other people to impact R.I.S.E and become a part of R.I.S.E, for however many years. Like I we try to support as many people as possible, through fellowship, through creating zines and such. But I also think of R.I.S E, and I think it's also important to think of R.I.S E, and as we're talking about like dreaming and imagining and honoring our ancestral kin, whether they're queer, trans, non-binary, indigenous, non-indigenous, like BIPOC, whatever. I think it's also important that we also remember that like within each person and each community like is this collective energy that is like that is being fed to us ancestrally, cosmologically. So I also think of R.I.S E as like a collective force of like ancestral energy that is like speaking for others who didn't have the opportunity to speak in ways that we are able to. um, there is like an ancestor who was like so fucked over by colonization that they never were able to have their voice heard. And I'm very privileged to be able to do that with my work. All the artists who engage with R.I.S E are, we're all very privileged. I mean, it takes a lot of like trauma and a lot of like fear and negativity that we have to like endure in order to get to a place where we're able to like create in these really amazing ways. And I don't think people like understand that. I think they see that we make work that just says like, decolonization and like indigenous sovereignty, but like it's not something we just wake up and like embrace. It's like something that, I mean, in order to get to some of these concepts, like we have to unravel so much of who we are as indigenous people. We have to like come to terms with the fact that like our ancestors were like murdered and raped, and that just the gross and grotesque and disgusting history of like American European inspired like settler colonialism. um we have to unravel that. Most of America wants us to get over it, but like it didn't happen to them in the same way. They aren't ignored in the same way. And so I think it's important for R.I.S E to think of itself as a collective of ancestral energy, because it means that we're recognizing both the horrible shit that happened to our ancestors, but also like the amazing, beautiful, and like powerful shit that like has helped us get to where we are, that is like so intrinsically tied to our survival.
Thanks. I think this is amazing, and it's something to really um, reflect on, like this notion of collectivity and the communal and what it can really do. Another element I wanted to ask you about, because it's central to R.I.S E, is, or are these are decolonial, and you were talking about it a moment ago, but I would like to ask you further, decolonial and non-normative, perhaps, understandings of gender. And I wanted to ask you if you could share more on this and how it informs the work that you do and how it informs this notion of collective work as well. And the genealogies, as I was mentioning before, like the lineage, who you are in relation, either practically in the present, but also in a more expanded way, conceptually, or in terms of, energy, or sort of bringing back dignities and voices that have been silenced historically.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's something that's like so much more deeper than just reclaiming like who we are as individuals. It's also like breaking apart from this sort of like disturbing simulated like perversion that we've all been fed, as a means to silence us, as a means to put us into like boxes of conformity that that don't allow us to really reach like any sort of like clear understanding of who we are as like cosmic beings. Like I feel like it's important for I think it's important for us to just remember that that these ideas, you know, they've pre-existed, like they've pre-existed empire, they've pre-existed science. You know, these ideas of gender and sexuality, you know, they are much more complex. And so I just think that it's really important to break away from that, even from notions of like or terminology that still continues to gender the planet or to gender the earth. You know, I mean, I think sometimes, you know, it comes off as a little bratty sometimes because I'm continually trying to remind like people, especially Indigenous people, um, who continue to say like, oh, Mother Earth and like Father Sky, and how these, like, even within our languages, like some of this like still exists. You know, I think it's important to remember that like these like there is no binary. Like the universe and the cosmos is like is shapeless. Like it's oh I don't know. It's a genderless sort of like entity that and so within that, you know, I think that that tends to sort of like shape the way that we engage with the world, the way that we see the world, the way that we devalue the sacredness of who we are as individuals, um, that exist within the universe. I think it also like really takes away from like the accountability that we have to ourselves and to one another. Um, and so I don't know. I mean, I feel like that could be like a another sort of like a whole other sort of conversation. But like, um, I think it's important that we remember that like as well, that, you know, some of the first people who encountered like harm and violence and murder within the Americas were oftentimes, you know, trans and who people who would be deemed as like queer folk, you know, within Indigenous communities. Like, you know, each Indigenous community has like a different sort of like gender system or ideas about gender. They have different ideas about sexuality and sexual orientation. um i also like I also would love to think that like other Indigenous communities maybe didn't even like have such like strong ideas about like gender or sexuality, you know, that like why can't we imagine a world where like these things um are not governed in such like intrusive and terrible ways? Why do we have to put like so much emphasis on genitals and sex? um and so I feel like it's important as well just to remember like the that settler colonialism is also tied to like transphobia, homophobia, queerphobia, um, you know, fear of the female body, control of the female body, um, and also like killing like the most vulnerable communities, the elderly and children. And that continues obviously today, like through the coronavirus pandemic, the ways that we um, don't value, you know, fat bodies, the elderly, the youth, people who are disabled, um, people who are like the most susceptible. You know, we as a society, as like societies that are touched by, you know, settler colonialism, like that is something that um, that was an act of political warfare to take out like these communities, you know, first and foremost. And so I think it is important for us to consider that like these communities like need to be supported like first and foremost at this point in order to tell our stories, and as a way of like restructuring any sort of like hope that we have as individuals as a part of like a larger sort of civilization going forward. But I hope that answered the question.
It does. Thank you. And I wanted to continue just to discuss a little bit more how intertwined the fields of art, activism, community organizing are in this project of R.I.S.E and Indigenous. So I wanted to ask you how you've been navigating this relationship between these fields that are, of course, always in relation with one another, but really here they become one in the work you've been doing. And also I wanted to ask you whether you could talk to us about any project that might somewhat, for those who might not know R.I.S.E Indigenous, somewhat to really get to understand more or less what kind of work, how you go about this type of work, and also what is how R.I.S.E moves across these practices and approaches, and what is the network of collaborators, as we were talking about the collective before, and so on and so forth. Really, how you're going about this this type of work.
Yeah, I think it's that's such a complicated question. I mean, we talked about it a little bit before, like the complexities of like how, well, I think one example would be like thinking about Richard Oakes, like who was a Mohawk activist and very active in the Indians of all tribes during like the formation of it in the 1968, 69, into 70, 71 and onward, the Indians of all tribes occupation of Alcatraz Island. And so, I was really inspired by a lot of the work that they were doing. It was like this really amazing moment of revitalization of Indigenous energy that was just speaking in a different language. It was a bunch of like younger Indigenous folks who were like coming up and, being like, who had also like, had more familiarity in urban spaces and such. They were going through like being indoctrinated into colleges and universities. It was just like an amazing opportunity and time period, like for Indigenous people to be speaking and working and creating and building community together. And so, I was thinking about Richard Oakes and his action of jumping off of like a schooner in San Francisco Bay and like swimming to the island of Alcatraz. And I was thinking of like Yayoi Kusama, doing naked dances on Wall Street, Yoko Ono, and probably a shit ton of other, performance artists who were up and coming during that time. Chris Burden and all these other folks who were making, amazing work. And so I was thinking about his act of like jumping off of that boat and swimming over to Alcatraz Island and planting a flag in it to reclaim it as like an act of performance art, as just that was just as important as a political action, as a political as inciting a political movement. And so I thought that it was complicated because talking with it within like a performative lens, I didn't want to like take away from the power of that action and what it meant and symbolized for Indigenous people and what it still symbolizes for Indigenous people. Alcatraz, the occupation of Alcatraz was like profound, is a profound, significant moment that like still doesn't get talked about. And so, I thought that if we're going to interrogate like art spaces, if we're going to like reclaim who we are as Indigenous people within art spaces, within art history, it's important as well to think of these moments as like as worthy events that like do actually influence art, that do have a profound impact on how we create and how we perform, and how we choose to perform as Indigenous people. And he made, the Indians of all tribes and that particular action, like it was something that was like, that was staged. You know, they called in the media, they made sure to bring other people in to like witness it, to see it. You know, they were supposed to land on the island. The water was like too wild that day, and they couldn't actually land on the island. And he was just so fed up with all the bullshit his whole life, that his ancestors went through. You know, he jumped in the water and swam over. It is documented in, you know, in some like archive and in the San Francisco area. So there is like actual video documentation of it. And so, you know, within thinking about that, like, I think it's important for us to consider all these other events that have happened within Indigenous history, because they impact what a contemporary art movement and what contemporary art spaces look like. And I hope that, you know, by doing even simple actions like thinking about that, or thinking about the graffiti that, you know, was painted outside of Alcatraz, and inserting that within like street art and graffiti art like history, you know, it helps to remind people to be mindful, that to include Indigenous peoples like throughout the way that we talk about art history in the Americas and beyond that. You know, I was so fucking fed up of continually having to learn like Western art history, and learning about like the Renaissance and all these other great bullshit like Western art movements, and while at the same time thinking like, well, I want to know what was going on like in the Americas. I want to know like what my tribe was doing, because we were thriving on this side of the world. You know, we were very active. We were building empires and cities and communities, and having like very utilitarian means about like producing artwork and creating objects. And so I think, yeah, sorry, I just think that it's important to sort of continue to sort of like weave through this, as complicated as and challenging as it may be. I don't think that it delegitimizes like any sort of like political action or activity. I think it just reaffirms the power that art has to create social change. And if that's one thing that R.I.S.E can do, you know, I think it is so completely needed. If we can build a space through a simple poster that challenges, you know, white feminism and first, second, and third waves of feminism, in order to reassert the fact that Indigenous feminism and Indigenous matriarchal like empowered spaces existed prior to like settler colonialism, that is so like, that is such a fundamental part of like human history and who we are as individuals. And so, yeah, we just got to do more of that.
And so then I wanted to ask you, because again, while prepping, we were talking about some of the amazing projects that R.I.S.E has developed and so on. And so then in particular, we were talking about the project that was presented, I think in 2019, correct me if I'm wrong, at Recess. And I just wanted to ask you, tell us a little bit about it, because I think it really exemplifies all of the things that we've been talking about so far, like this notion of collective, this notion of not conforming and really bringing back voices that have been silenced, this notion of collaboration and forming networks and creating new alliances and working around and through kinship. So I think it's, you were saying while we were prepping, that it was this moment of sort of important density somewhat. And so I think it would be great, since I think we have, I don't know, only 20 minutes left, but I wanted to make sure that we're able to have a look at it through your words and through your experience, of course, just for people to get to know it.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah. So what you're referring to is this exhibition. Well, I guess this space that we created called Collective Fury. And so Recess Art Recess is an art space in Brooklyn, and we had applied to a session that they support. They support like a variety of different sessions every single year, and I had applied for it with the intention of going in there and creating like an all Indigenous sort of space that would, you know, revolve around exhibition, programming, and an info shop or like a small store. And what ended up happening was, shit, this was 2019. I believe, I'm like almost certain that it was 2019. Yeah, because I had shaved my head off, or I had shaved all my hair off. So this is like the accumulation of like how much hair I've grown since then. And so yeah, sorry, it's like almost been 2 years, and it feels like the world has changed so much since then. But that exhibition was about the importance of creating an all Indigenous space within a place like New York City. I titled it Collective Fury because I was thinking about embracing anger and unrest as like a form of healing and reclaiming our power as Indigenous people. But I mean, it also came out of like just seeing the ways that non-Indigenous people see Indigenous anger, or how white people see, you know, Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, Jewish, Middle Eastern anger, queer anger, trans anger, you know, and how we are shamed for it, but yet at the same time, you know, we are continually bombarded with like mass murders and mass shootings and police brutality, anger, or just like simple comments on Instagram that tell us to get over settler colonialism, and that, you know, we should await a civil war because like a massacre is on its way. You know, like there are continual forms of white rage that, you know, are deadly that we see in our communities that are not very shy right now at all. But yet, you know, Indigenous anger oftentimes is enacted against ourselves or our own people. It again is like this like self-perpetuating cycle that is, you know, the leftover remnants of like assimilative and or conservative assimilative tactics that are used as warfare against Indigenous peoples that we in turn inflict against ourselves and one another. And so, you know, I was thinking that, you know, again, like learning our history as Indigenous people, like that is something that not every single Indigenous person survives. You know, I felt shame for the longest time about really not being able to embrace certain aspects, or really having like a pride in who I was like as an Indigenous person. It took moving to like an all white city for me to like really understand how I took advantage of that in a place like New Mexico, but also how like New Mexico is like this heteropatriarchal, like, you know, Christian based space. Like Catholicism like runs amok there. It, you know, it infiltrates our communities and such. Mormonism is like the next thing that is infiltrating our communities. But how, you know, within like even growing up and such, like, you know, I was meant to not survive. I had so much shame that was inflicted on me by, you know, my peers in high school and such. And so anyway, I'm sorry, I'm like really going off topic here, but, you know, I feel like I wanted to sort of like build that space as a way to remind people that like what comes out of like Indigenous anger is healing, is confronting like our own personal well-being. It is finding and building and sustaining community. So many Indigenous people in Lenapehoking, in Mannahatta, showed up on a continual basis. Like, that was so affirming. I should say that so many Indigenous femmes showed up. That is like very important to make a distinction of. Is the fact that like a lot of the times, we like femmes and queer folk are doing like this really hard, rigorous work. A lot of folks from the Indigenous Kinship Collective showed up, held space, contributed to the dialogue. Maria Hupfield was a panel participant and spoke about, a lot of her engagement with New York City, reminded all of us that, there are Indigenous people who are actively working in New York and Lenapehoking and Mannahatta. And that's really important, because I think, us as Indigenous people or outside, or people who aren't Indigenous people practicing in Mannahatta or Lenapehoking, coming into those spaces, like, we often feel like there isn't enough representation, but there's a shit ton of artists who are out there creating work and who have been making work. Jeffrey Gibson was another artist who we met with and engaged with during Collective Fury. He had come in and had worked on a photo shoot, and I was very, fortunate to wear one of his garments and be photographed in them. But we also had a moment where we had a conversation. It was an hour-long conversation. He had curated like a collection of Indigenous records, so we also listened to like, Buffy St. Marie and Link Ray, Mildred Bailey, a lot of these Indigenous musicians who had a really strong impact on the way music is shaped within culture and has been shaped throughout culture in the Americas. We also had a conversation about like our experiences as Indigenous people throughout different generations. Like, we're like 10 years apart, something like that, but we still have had like different experiences as queer people navigating space on and off of reservations. And that was a very important conversation, because it's not something that like, I don't feel like the MoMA or the Metropolitan Museum of Art like gives a fuck about. A lot of the times these spaces, the new museum, just tokenize Indigenous peoples or, marginalized communities as a way to, extract some sort of like social capital or self-worth from it. It is very disingenuous. So it, Collective Fury was a really amazing opportunity for us to really come into a space like New York, Lenapehoking, and, remind people that, this is what all Indigenous programming looks like. This is like what is possible if this sort of space was like properly supported, maintained, and funded in a place like New York City. With or without you collecting our work. Like, just give us the fucking money to like do what we want to do. And, whether or not we have like a 501c3, whether or not we have like, whether or not you can write it off on your taxes or account for it, like, you need to be making this work. You need to be giving like up your money, your funds, your land, your institutions, in order for us to create this work. If it means that like a space like the Whitney or the Met or MoMA needs to like give up their place for like 2 years or often to infinity, like, that is something that we are owed, and that's something that that is a conversation that completely got lost this year, is the fact that, these institutions don't have our well-being at hand. They're not going to sustain us in the long run, so we need to be able to, like holding them accountable. We need to be taking back those institutions. And, Black, Indigenous, Brown communities need to be the ones who are sort of like, having conversations, building programming, and continuing to shape the way that we engage with art, like from here on out. And Collective Fury was sort of, it wasn't necessarily at the time like an attempt to do that, but as I look back at it, like it creates like a very interesting sort of like blueprint for like what those types of spaces would look like in each community across the country, and how like necessary those spaces are across the country. And it was all about sort of just, you know, creating support for the voices that were already there. You know, we worked with Jeffrey Gibson, Maria Hupfield, Nicole Wallace, Laura Ortman, and given the opportunity, you know, we would go in there and work further, because there's so many profound and amazing artists who are working right now, who just don't have the support that, you know, larger institutions could afford them.
Of course. Thanks for this. And I'm just gonna, for those who are watching and listening to this, I just want to remind that on this talks page on Call for Curators, we also have links to the R.I.S.E project and so on, so that people who may want to have a look after this or read more have the chance to do it. This is the URL. And also thanks, because the next question I had, I think you wonderfully just, you have addressed it already, which was really how to think about institutions and how to work within that. So with that, I will just then move to my last question. And in the meantime, I just encourage whoever might have a question just to type it in the comment section, both on Facebook and YouTube, so that we can get it and ask it before our time is up. But then what I wanted to ask you somewhat to conclude is, well, two things really. I'm going to bring them together. On the one hand, I wanted to ask you how you're thinking about sustainability, like how you understand this notion, how you're understanding this notion for R.I.S.E Indigenous. And on the other hand, but I guess they're connected somewhat, I also wanted to ask you how you're thinking about this project's life cycle. We talked a little bit about it, no? Yeah. When we were prepping for this talk, how you're understanding also this notion of life cycles. And so also thinking about 2020 and sort of what a complicated and disastrous in certain ways year has been, like also whether that has changed your thinking about both how to sustain R.I.S.E Indigenous moving forward, what is the life cycle of this project, what can happen next within this framework, and so on. So just kind of working across these two notions, I just wanted to ask you what you're thinking about right now, what your thoughts are in this regard.
Awesome. Yeah, no, this is awesome. I'm going to grab my power cord real quick.
Go ahead. In the meantime, I'm just going to share one last time the IG handle for those who might want to have a look at R.I.S.E Indigenous Instagram account, and then from there, the links and everything that are normally being shared. And also going to share again the link to the Call for Curators talks website with all the links.
All right.
Go ahead.
Sorry about that.
No, I think that's important. Otherwise, we wouldn't have you speak. If your computer just runs out of battery, then we have a real problem. Go ahead.
Yeah. Yeah. So this year has been, I don't know. Yeah, caught every single one of us off guard. A lot of projects, you know, obviously got canceled or postponed, or you know, are put on the back burner indefinitely. So what does sustainability look like at this point? Yeah, I don't know. You know, R.I.S.E just hit 100,000 followers on Instagram over the, you know, last weekend of November, one of the last weekends of November. And so that was really weird. You know, I feel like this year we just gained a ton of followers. And I made a post about it that was just like, we'd never intended to be a space that like we weren't striving for reaching this many people. I mean, actually we were like, we want to reach this many people, but that wasn't a necessity of ours. The goal that we've had, that R.I.S.E has as its foundation, is about creating awareness about radical Indigenous sort of perspectives, and initially it was about creating free artwork that was accessible to Indigenous people like on reservations. But within that comment, I realized that it's R.I.S.E is not like a perfect space. We have fucked up, and we've we fucked up before. We stood beside communities that we shouldn't have. We thought that some communities would step up and sort of also realize some of the bad politics they had, without realizing that like we should just worry about like what we are doing, and sort of maintain and sustain that. And so I don't think R.I.S.E is a perfect space. I think it's very reflective of like the problems that exist in all Indigenous spaces, whether they're radical, conservative, traditional, urban, or whatnot. But at the same time, like I think it's important to like not necessarily be afraid of failure and what that means, and how success is also like a colonial like tactic and a colonial agenda. But also like what amazing gifts like come out of like our failures. How you build community out of them is an amazing thing. A lot of the really rewarding things that R.I.S.E has become and offers like has come out of failure. I was denied a Native Arts and Cultures Foundation grant a few years back, and that was something that would have like really impacted my career and created like so much support. And through that entire process, I realized like some of even Indigenous spaces like don't have like Indigenous, queer, trans, and two-spirit people like at they don't have our well-being like at heart. Like they will support us every so often, but like in order to make like these institutional changes, like they still come to spaces being like, oh, we don't know how to do that. Like, and it's like, well, you do that by supporting Indigenous, queer, trans, and two-spirit artists. Like it's not that difficult. You make these changes, you decide to make these changes across like the way your organization or institution functions, and you strive to make those things actually happen. You bring in judges who are from those communities to have these conversations. You don't ask artists who you deny a grant to give you a list of like names and people like for the following year to contact. Like you giving them like an award actively just does that. It creates exposure on your end. But that cleared the way for R.I.S.E and myself to like self-fund an art and poetry fellowship that was geared toward queer, trans, non-binary, two-spirit artists. And I think that's something that has been effective like in queer communities, in trans communities, in marginalized communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous, and such, that if you don't give us the means to support ourselves, like we in turn create opportunities to support one another. And so that fellowship was an opportunity for us to be like, if you won't support us and you refuse to see how it's done, then we're going to show you how it's done. And I'm trying to remind myself at this point going forward in this really chaotic year that like, that's what needs to happen. You know, we were also denied a creative capital grant to create like a survivance archive of like Indigenous contemporary artists who are actively working right now. And, you know, I got so disheartened, you know, from being denied that I completely remembered that like, whether or not that grant exists, whether or not that grant like comes into existence or we attain it at some point, that this work needs to get done, that we need to exist as a space that like actively supports and produces work. And so if that means going forward that like R.I.S.E like needs to help, you know, Indigenous writers like publish work, whether it's like art in like an art book form or poetry chapbook or such, like I think that's one thing that obviously needs to happen. You know, we can't wait around for art institutions or publishers or publishing houses to see how we're profitable, to see our worth. You know, we need to be able to have these conversations. There is too much at stake at this point for us not to be supporting one another. And so I think, you know, going forward, that's what I hope R.I.S.E continues to strive to do. For as long as we're relevant, for as long as we're able to really continue to pursue that. But I also realize that there's an entire generation of amazing, more radical and more ferocious and eager and brilliant like artists and creative people who need to also be supported and like building the spaces that they need. And so if there's any way that like R.I.S.E can just be a catalyst for even just igniting that flame of even just being like, well, this space doesn't serve me, then like I hope that that's what it does. And I hope that that's what my practice does, that even in all my imperfections and ways that I fuck up, I hope that it at least inspires other people to realize that they can do it differently and that they can do it better and that they should, you know, because it's only going to get us to where we need to get going.
That's wonderful. Thank you so very much for being so generous and so open. And I always thank speakers, especially throughout this time, because I know it's taxing. It takes, you know, time and energy and focus at a time in which all of these things are rare, and we really have to focus in order to renew and refresh ourselves and so on. So thank you so very much for this. I really, really appreciate it. We don't have questions. People are shy this evening, but what I'm going to do is, as always, I'm going to share this email address. We're very happy to act as a bridge. If whoever's looking and watching and listening wants to ask a question further down the road, please feel free to email us. We are always very happy to connect people and to act as a bridge as much as we can. So with that being said, I want to just thank everyone for being with us. And I want to remind everyone that this is the very last talk of 2020 for us. So this is a wonderful ending, opening up to new beginnings, hopefully. So we will be back in 2021 with a continuation of the series and a new format. And we will be announcing our speakers and guests in the new year. So I'm just going to share one last time the URL of the project so that you can access links and resources about this conversation, past conversations, but also stay up to date on what we're going to do next. And so again, thank you very much. And thanks to all that have been watching this.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yeah, that was, it's amazing also just to be able to have the time to sort of like think through these things and talk about them. Especially when we're like so secluded in different parts of the world. But I really appreciate it. And Thank you very much. And if you ever like have any questions, you know, feel free to reach out either through R.I.S.E's Instagram or my own.
Wonderful. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.